I was in my bedroom folding laundry that Tuesday afternoon when I heard my daughter-in-law Amanda's voice drift up through the heating vent. Our old Victorian house has quirks like that. Sound travels in unexpected ways through the original ductwork. I'd grown so accustomed to the house's acoustic peculiarities over 43 years of living here that I barely noticed them anymore. But that day, something in Amanda's tone made me freeze with one of my late husband's old sweaters still clutched in my hands. If you're watching this video, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. Your support means everything, and I promise this story will show you why we must always trust our instincts, even when it breaks our hearts. The words came through clearly, deliberately spoken in that slow, patient voice adults use when teaching children something important. Listen carefully, sweetie. Grandma is getting very old and forgetful. When she goes to heaven, this beautiful house becomes ours. All her jewelry, her car, everything. Daddy and I have been waiting so long. Just be nice to her and don't tell anyone what we talk about, okay? I stood there, absolutely motionless, as my 8-year-old grandson Tyler's small voice responded with innocent enthusiasm. Like in that movie where the family gets the castle? Will I get my own room? Amanda laughed, a sound I'd heard 1,000 times at family dinners. But now it seemed to carry a different quality, something calculating I'd never noticed before. Yes, baby, you'll get the biggest room upstairs, the one with the window seat that looks over the garden. Won't that be wonderful? My legs felt weak, and I lowered myself onto the edge of my bed, still holding that sweater. The afternoon sunlight streamed through my lace curtains, catching dust motes in the air, and everything looked exactly as it had 5 minutes earlier. But nothing would ever be the same. I'd invited them over for what I thought was a casual visit. Amanda had called that morning saying Tyler wanted to see Grandma and maybe help me bake cookies. I'd been so delighted, so eager to spend time with my grandson, that I'd immediately started preparing his favorite chocolate chip recipe. They'd arrived 30 minutes ago, and I'd left them downstairs to play in the living room while I came up to put away some laundry. Such an ordinary moment, such a devastating discovery. I pressed my hand against my chest, feeling my heart hammering beneath my palm. At 67 years old, I'd survived my share of shocks. My husband Robert's sudden heart attack 3 years ago, my own breast cancer scare a decade before that, the loss of my parents when I was far too young, but this felt different. This was betrayal from within my own family, from people I'd loved and supported and welcomed into my life without reservation. Amanda had been my daughter-in-law for 10 years. I'd watched her marry my son Daniel in this very house's backyard, had held her hand through 2 difficult pregnancies, had babysat Tyler and his little sister Emma countless times. I'd given her my grandmother's pearl necklace on her wedding day. And now she was teaching my grandson to view my death as a real estate opportunity. The worst part, the detail that made my stomach turn, was the calculated nature of it. This wasn't a spontaneous comment, some thoughtless remark made in frustration. The way she'd said, "Listen carefully and don't tell anyone what we talk about," revealed planning, intention, secrecy. How many times had they had conversations like this? What else had they been teaching my grandchildren about me behind closed doors? I thought about all the times over the past year when Amanda had asked casual questions about my will, about whether I'd thought about end-of-life planning, about what I wanted done with my jewelry collection. I'd answered honestly, touched by what I interpreted as her concern for my wishes. Now those conversations took on a sinister new dimension. I could still hear them downstairs, Tyler chattering excitedly about which room he'd choose, Amanda encouraging his fantasies about my death with that same patient, nurturing tone she used when teaching him to read. Every maternal instinct in my body screamed at me to march downstairs and confront her immediately, to scoop up my grandson and explain that what she was teaching him was wrong, cruel, grotesque. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the mention of Daniel. Daddy and I have been waiting so long. My son was part of this. My own child, the boy I'd raised to value integrity and family above all else, was apparently counting down the days until I died so he could claim my home. If I confronted Amanda now in anger, without proof, without a plan, What would happen? They'd deny everything, call it a misunderstanding, and I'd lose any advantage I currently held. No, I needed to think, to observe, to understand the full scope of what was happening before I acted. The house had been my whole adult life. Robert and I had bought it in 1982, a neglected Victorian that needed everything. New plumbing, electrical work, a complete kitchen renovation. We'd spent our first 5 years of marriage living in construction dust, learning home repair through trial and error, slowly transforming this house into something beautiful. Robert had refinished every floor himself, spending weekends on his hands and knees with the sander he'd rented from the hardware store. I'd stripped and repainted every piece of crown molding, standing on ladders while pregnant with Daniel, determined to make this house perfect for our growing family. We'd planted the garden together, chosen every tree, designed the flower beds that now bloomed reliably every spring. This wasn't just property to me. It was memory made solid, love made tangible. After Robert died, people had suggested I sell, move into something smaller, maybe a condo with less maintenance. But this house was where I felt closest to him, where I could still hear his laughter echoing through the rooms, where every corner held some story of our life together. The kitchen where we'd danced to old jazz records while cooking Sunday dinners. The back porch where we'd watched thunderstorms roll in. The bedroom where he'd held me the night we learned about my cancer, promising we'd fight it together. I'd poured $47,000 of his life insurance money into updating the house. New roof, new HVAC system, modernized bathrooms. Not because I planned to sell, but because I wanted it to last, to remain beautiful, to be something I could eventually pass to Daniel with pride. And now I knew that Daniel and Amanda were eagerly awaiting my death so they could cash out decades of our love and labor. I stood up slowly, carefully folding Robert's sweater and placing it in the drawer where I kept his things. Clothes I couldn't bear to give away, items that still faintly carried his scent of Old Spice and sawdust. I walked to my bedroom window and looked down at the garden, at the rose bushes Robert had planted for our 20th anniversary. At the stone path we'd laid together one memorable summer. Everything I could see represented sacrifice, effort, dreams built brick by brick and paid for with our sweat and money and time. And my son had reduced it all to dollars and square footage, something to be liquidated and divided. I heard the front door open and close, Amanda's voice calling cheerfully, "Mom, we're heading out. Tyler has soccer practice." I composed myself, forced a smile onto my face, and descended the stairs. Tyler ran to hug me, his small arms wrapping around my waist with such genuine affection that my eyes burned with tears. "Bye, Grandma. I love you." He looked up at me with Robert's brown eyes, my son's dimpled smile, completely innocent of the poison his mother had been feeding him. I kissed his forehead and told him I loved him too, holding him perhaps a moment longer than usual. Amanda stood by the door, perfectly styled in her expensive yoga clothes, designer purse slung over her shoulder. She smiled at me warmly, kissed my cheek, thanked me for having them over. "We should do this more often," she said brightly. "Tyler just adores spending time with you. You're so important to him." I looked into her blue eyes and saw nothing but practiced sincerity, the kind of performance that comes from years of saying things you don't mean. "Yes," I heard myself reply in a voice that sounded remarkably steady. "We should definitely do this more often." I waved as they pulled out of the driveway in the BMW I'd helped them purchase 2 years ago when their old car died. A $15,000 gift I'd considered an investment in my son's family's well-being. I stood on my porch until they disappeared around the corner, my smile finally fading into something harder, more determined. I'd always prided myself on being the kind of mother who didn't interfere, who respected boundaries, who trusted her adult children to make their own choices. I'd bitten my tongue so many times over the years when I disagreed with Amanda's parenting choices or Daniel's financial decisions. I'd supported them unconditionally, babysat whenever they needed, provided money for emergencies without asking questions. When Daniel had been laid off 2 years ago, I'd paid their mortgage for 6 months, $1,400 total, until he found new work. When Emma needed expensive dental surgery, I'd covered the $8,000 insurance wouldn't pay. I'd given freely, lovingly, never keeping score, never expecting anything in return except the joy of helping my family thrive. And they'd been planning for my death, counting my assets, teaching my grandchildren to see me as a temporary inconvenience. I walked back into my house and locked the door behind me, something I rarely did in the middle of the afternoon. The silence felt different now, less peaceful and more isolating. I returned to the living room where they'd been sitting, examining it with new eyes. Had Amanda been mentally calculating the value of my furniture while I'd baked cookies? Had she been planning which pieces she'd keep and which she'd sell? I thought about the antique sideboard that had belonged to Robert's grandmother, the Persian rug we'd bought on our trip to Turkey, the grandfather clock that had been a gift from my parents. Each item had a story, a meaning beyond monetary value. But to Amanda, they were apparently just assets to be liquidated. I needed information before I could act. I needed to understand exactly what they'd been planning, how long this had been going on, what they'd already done. I couldn't confront them based on a single overheard conversation, no matter how damning. I needed to be smart, strategic, as calculated as they'd been. So I made myself a cup of tea with hands that trembled only slightly, sat down at my kitchen table, and began to think through everything that had seemed odd or suspicious over the past year. Comments that had seemed harmless at the time, but now took on different meanings. Actions I'd excused as busy adult children neglecting their mother, but which might have been something more deliberate. The way Amanda had started asking about my doctor appointments, wanting to know specific details about my health, my medications, my blood pressure readings. She'd framed it as concern, as wanting to help me stay healthy, and I'd been touched by her attention. But now I wondered if she'd been gathering information, assessing my life expectancy, calculating timelines, the way Daniel had suggested, multiple times, that I should add Amanda's name to my bank accounts, just in case something happened, and I needed someone to pay my bills. I'd demurred, uncomfortable with the idea, but not wanting to seem like I didn't trust them. Had that been an attempt to gain access to my money while I was still alive? The way they'd both encouraged me to downsize my jewelry collection, to sell pieces I never wore, to simplify my possessions. Had they been trying to liquidate assets early? 3 months ago, Amanda had asked to borrow my engagement ring, a 2-carat diamond Robert had saved for months to buy, claiming she wanted to have it sized as a reference for updating her own ring. I'd hesitated but ultimately agreed, and she'd kept it for 2 weeks before returning it. At the time, I'd thought nothing of the delay. Now I wondered if she'd had it appraised, or worse, if she'd had a replica made and returned a fake. The thought made me nauseated. I got up from the table, went to my bedroom, and retrieved the ring from my jewelry box. I held it up to the light, trying to see if anything looked different, but I had no way to tell. I'd need to have it professionally examined. I thought about Tyler and Emma, my innocent grandchildren being shaped by their parents' greed. Emma was only 5, too young probably to understand these conversations. But Tyler was 8, old enough to absorb values, to learn what family meant, to internalize his parents' priorities. What kind of people were Daniel and Amanda raising? Children who saw their grandmother as an obstacle, who were taught to be nice to her not out of genuine love, but as a strategy to secure inheritance? The thought of Tyler's sweet face, his enthusiastic hugs, now possibly motivated by rehearsed manipulation rather than real affection, felt like a knife to my heart. But I couldn't blame him. He was a child, innocent, being taught terrible lessons by the adults who should have been teaching him better. I wondered how much of Daniel's apparent love for me over these past few years had been genuine versus strategic. The weekly phone calls checking in on me, were those really about connection or about monitoring my health and mental state? The insistence that I keep emergency contacts updated, that I have regular medical checkups, that I install security systems, was that actually concern for my well-being or ensuring their investment was protected? Every interaction we'd had recently now seemed suspect, tainted by the possibility of ulterior motives. It was a horrible way to feel about your own child. This corrosive doubt that ate away at every memory, every moment of apparent love. My throat felt tight as I acknowledged the scope of my heartbreak. Losing Robert had been devastating, but at least I'd had decades of unambiguous love to cherish, clear memories untainted by doubt. This was different. This forced me to question everything, to re-examine years of relationship through a lens of possible manipulation. Had Daniel really wanted to spend time with me last Christmas? Or had he been checking to see if I'd updated my will? When Amanda had cried at Robert's funeral, holding my hand through the service, had those tears been real or performance? I hated these questions, hated what they revealed about the person I was becoming, but I couldn't ignore them. The afternoon light was fading when I finally stood up, my tea long cold, my decision made. I wouldn't confront them yet. I wouldn't give them warning or opportunity to cover their tracks. Instead, I would watch, listen, gather evidence, and understand fully what I was dealing with. And then, when I had all the information I needed, I would act. Not out of anger, though God knows I felt plenty of that, but out of a cold, clear determination to protect what Robert and I had built and to teach my son a lesson about the consequences of greed. They wanted to inherit my house? They'd inherit exactly what they deserved, which was nothing but the knowledge that their own actions had cost them everything. Back when Daniel was small, this house had rung with different sounds. Children's laughter echoing through the hallways, the thump of small feet racing up and down the stairs, the constant soundtrack of family life. Robert would come home from his job at the automotive plant, and Daniel would rush to greet him, climbing him like a tree, demanding to be thrown in the air. I'd watch them from the kitchen doorway, my heart full to bursting with the simple joy of having my two favorite people under one roof. We weren't wealthy. Robert's salary covered the basics and not much more. But what we lacked in money we compensated for in time, attention, and genuine presence. I remember teaching Daniel to ride his bike in our driveway, running alongside him until he found his balance, cheering when he finally pedaled away on his own. I remember Robert building him a treehouse in the massive oak in our backyard, the two of them spending entire weekends hammering and sawing, coming inside filthy and exhausted and completely happy. I remember family dinners around our kitchen table every single night. No television, no distractions, just conversation about our days. Daniel would tell us about school, about his friends, about his dreams of becoming a firefighter or an astronaut or a doctor depending on the week. We'd listen to every word like it was scripture, because to us, it was. We'd saved obsessively for Daniel's education. From the time he was born, Robert and I had agreed that college would be non-negotiable, that we'd do whatever it took to give our son opportunities we'd never had. Robert picked up overtime shifts at the plant. I took evening cleaning jobs at office buildings, scrubbing toilets and vacuuming floors after my day job at the public library. We skipped vacations, drove old cars, bought secondhand clothes, and funneled every extra dollar into Daniel's college fund. By the time he graduated high school, we'd saved $83,000, enough to send him to state university without loans, without debt, without the burden that crippled so many of his peers. I'd worked at the library for 32 years, checking out books and helping patrons find information in the days before internet search engines. It wasn't glamorous work, and it certainly wasn't lucrative. My highest salary had been $38,000 a year. But I'd loved it. I'd loved the quiet dignity of connecting people with stories, the satisfaction of helping someone find exactly the book they needed. I'd loved that it allowed me to be home when Daniel got out of school, to be present for his childhood in ways that would have been impossible with a more demanding career. Robert used to joke that I'd read half the library collection over the years, and it was probably true. Those books had been my escape, my education, my window to worlds beyond our small town. Robert had been the bedrock of our family, steady and reliable as sunrise. He'd worked at the same plant for 41 years, never missing a shift, taking pride in the quality of his work even when the corporate overlords didn't appreciate it. He'd been passed over for promotions in favor of younger men with college degrees, but he'd never grown bitter, never complained beyond the occasional grumble after a particularly frustrating day. He'd believed in the dignity of hard work, in keeping your promises, in being a man your family could count on. He'd also been funny and gentle and romantic in the quiet ways that mattered, leaving me notes in my lunch, bringing home flowers for no reason, dancing with me in our kitchen when some song on the radio reminded him of our wedding. When Daniel had announced he was dating Amanda, Robert and I had been cautiously optimistic. She came from money. Her father owned a chain of car dealerships across the state, and we'd worried about whether she'd accept our more modest lifestyle. But she'd seemed genuinely sweet during those early visits, complimenting my cooking, helping with dishes, asking thoughtful questions about our lives. She'd told us stories about growing up with wealthy but emotionally distant parents, about how she admired the warmth and connection in our family. She'd made Daniel happy, and that had been enough for us. When he'd proposed after 2 years of dating, we'd welcomed her into the family with open hearts. Their wedding had been held right here in our backyard on a perfect June afternoon. Amanda's parents had offered to pay for something extravagant at a country club, but she'd insisted she wanted something more intimate, more meaningful. She'd said our garden was the most beautiful venue she could imagine. I'd been so touched, so convinced that despite her wealthy upbringing, she'd truly adopted our values. Robert and I had spent weeks preparing the yard, planting extra flowers, stringing lights through the trees, setting up a tent just in case of rain. The day itself had been magical. 70 guests, homemade food, dancing under the stars. I'd watched Daniel look at Amanda like she was the only person in the world, and I'd cried happy tears, believing I was watching my son step into a beautiful future. When Tyler was born 2 years later, I'd been at the hospital within an hour of getting Daniel's call. I'd held my grandson when he was barely an hour old, studying his tiny features and seeing my late mother's chin, Robert's eyes, my own nose. The continuation of our family, proof that what we'd built would extend beyond our own lives. I'd rocked him while Amanda slept, whispering promises about all the things we'd do together. All the love I'd pour into him, I'd meant every word. When Emma arrived 3 years later, I'd felt the same overwhelming rush of love, the same fierce protectiveness, the same certainty that being a grandmother was one of life's greatest privileges. Robert had died when Tyler was 5 and Emma was 2, too young to really remember him, which remains one of my deepest sorrows. He'd had a massive heart attack while mowing the lawn on a Saturday morning. I'd been inside making lunch when I'd heard the mower sputter to silence. I'd glanced out the window and seen him collapsed on the grass. By the time the ambulance arrived, he was already gone. The doctors said he probably didn't suffer, that it had been instantaneous. But that was small comfort against the enormous crater his absence left in my life. 53 years old, a year away from retirement, decades of plans unmade. Daniel had been devastated. They'd been close, father and son, in ways that transcended the typical. Robert had taught Daniel everything he knew about cars, about home repair, about being a man who took care of his family. They'd spent countless hours together in our garage, fixing things, building things, just being together. At the funeral, Daniel had given a eulogy that reduced everyone to tears, talking about his father's integrity, his work ethic, his quiet devotion to our family. He'd promised to live by Robert's values, to make him proud, to pass those lessons on to his own children. I'd believed him. Standing beside him at the cemetery, watching Robert's casket being lowered into the ground, I'd thought that at least I still had my son, that Robert's legacy would continue through him. The life insurance money, $175,000, had been Robert's final gift to me. He'd maintained that policy for 30 years, paying the premiums faithfully even when money was tight, insisting I'd need security if anything happened to him. I'd used it carefully, strategically. $47,000 for necessary house updates, $30,000 to pay off our remaining mortgage, giving me a home I owned free and clear, $15,000 for Daniel's BMW when his car died, $20,000 in various gifts and loans to Daniel and Amanda over the following 3 years. The rest I'd kept in savings, living modestly on Robert's pension and my own small retirement, determined to preserve as much as possible to leave to Daniel eventually. I'd imagined him inheriting not just money, but security, freedom from financial stress, The ability to give his children the same advantages we'd worked so hard to give him. Over the 3 years since Robert's death, Daniel and Amanda had become fixtures in my life in new ways. They'd called frequently, visited often, included me in family activities. I'd been grateful for their presence, for the way they'd helped fill the enormous silence Robert left behind. Looking back now, I could see the pattern emerging. The increasing number of questions about my finances, about my plans, about my will. At the time, I'd interpreted it as natural concern for an aging parent. My own mother had developed dementia in her 70s, and I'd assumed Daniel was worried about similar deterioration in me. But maybe those questions had been something else entirely. Maybe they'd been assessing, planning, calculating how long they'd have to wait. I'd never been secretive about my finances. When Daniel asked questions, I'd answered honestly. Yes, I owned the house outright. Yes, I had about $80,000 in savings. Yes, my monthly income from pensions and Social Security was sufficient for my needs. Yes, I'd written a will leaving everything to him. I'd seen no reason to hide any of this. He was my only child, my heir by default, the person I loved most in the world. It had never occurred to me that this information could be weaponized, that my transparency could be feeding their impatience for my death. What a fool I'd been. What a naive, trusting fool. Last Christmas had been the last holiday we'd all spent together, just 4 months ago. We'd gathered here, in this house, for Christmas Eve dinner. I'd cooked for 2 days. Turkey, ham, all the traditional sides, homemade pies. Tyler and Emma had been excited about presents, running around the house with that beautiful Christmas energy children have. Daniel and Amanda had seemed loving, attentive, bringing me an expensive cashmere sweater and a gift certificate to my favorite restaurant. We'd taken family photos in front of the Christmas tree. We'd sung carols. We'd laughed. And all the while, apparently, they'd been mentally counting down my remaining Christmases, calculating when this house would be theirs. I thought about Amanda's comment to Tyler. Daddy and I have been waiting so long. How long exactly? Since Robert's death 3 years ago? Since their wedding 10 years ago? Had this always been their plan, to marry into the family, endure the old folks until inheritance time came? Or had it developed gradually, their initial affection souring into resentment as years passed and I stubbornly refused to die on their preferred timeline? I'd never know the truth of when it started, but the realization that it existed at all was enough to change everything. The following morning, I woke with absolute clarity about what I needed to do first. I needed to talk to Tyler privately, carefully, without alerting Daniel or Amanda to my suspicions. Children his age were remarkably honest when approached correctly, before they'd fully learned the art of sophisticated lying. I needed to understand what else he'd been told, what other conversations had happened, how deeply this poison had spread, but I had to be careful. Tyler loved his parents, trusted them completely, and I couldn't traumatize him by suggesting they'd done something wrong. This would require delicacy, strategy, patience. I called Daniel's cell phone around 9 in the morning, knowing he'd be at work. "Hey, Mom," he answered, his voice warm and casual. No trace of the monster I now knew lurked beneath. "What's up?" I kept my own voice equally light. "I was thinking about taking Tyler to that new children's museum on Saturday. Just the two of us. Give you and Amanda a break. Let Emma have some one-on-one time with you both. Would that work?" There was a pause, and I could almost hear the mental calculations. A pause long enough to make my heart sink, as I wondered if he'd refuse, if they wanted to keep Tyler away from unsupervised time with me. But then he agreed, probably unable to think of a reason to say no that wouldn't sound suspicious. "Sure, Mom. That sounds great. Tyler would love that. Want us to drop him off Saturday morning?" Saturday arrived with bright sunshine and my stomach tied in anxious knots. Tyler bounced into my house at 9 o'clock, full of energy and excitement about the museum. Amanda had dressed him carefully. Nice jeans, a collared shirt, his good sneakers. She'd always been particular about his appearance, about projecting a certain image. She kissed him goodbye, reminded him to be good for Grandma, and told me they'd pick him up around 4. I watched their car disappear, took a deep breath, and turned to my grandson with what I hoped was a natural smile. "Ready for an adventure?" He nodded enthusiastically, grabbing my hand with complete trust, and my heart ached with the knowledge that I was about to ask him questions that might burden his innocence. We spent the first 2 hours at the museum, genuinely enjoying the exhibits, letting him play and explore without any agenda beyond his happiness. I bought him lunch at the museum cafe and we sat together eating pizza and French fries, talking about his favorite exhibits. He was particularly fascinated by the dinosaur section, telling me elaborate stories about T-Rexes and velociraptors, with all the passionate expertise of an 8-year-old obsessed with prehistoric creatures. I listened and laughed and asked questions, letting him be completely comfortable before I ventured into more dangerous territory. On the drive home, with Tyler relaxed and happy in the passenger seat, I asked casually, "Did you have fun at my house the other day, when you came over with your mom?" He nodded, still looking out the window at passing scenery. "Yeah, it was fun. Mom let me play on her phone." I glanced at him. "Did you guys talk about anything special?" He hesitated, and I could see something shift in his expression, a flicker of uncertainty. "Mom says I'm not supposed to tell you some things." My hands tightened on the steering wheel, but I kept my voice gentle. "Sweetie, grandmas are always safe to talk to. You're never in trouble for telling me anything. I just like knowing what makes you happy." Tyler was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with competing instructions. His mother's command for secrecy versus his natural inclination to trust his grandmother. Finally, he said quietly, "Mom talks to me about when you go to heaven. She says when really old people go to heaven, they leave their houses and stuff for their families." I felt my chest tighten, but forced myself to sound merely curious, not upset. "Does she talk about that a lot?" He nodded. "Kind of a lot. She shows me pictures of the rooms in your house and asks which one I'd want. She says you're very old and sick, and that it's okay to think about it because everybody dies eventually." The words hit me like physical blows, but I maintained my composure. "Tyler, honey, I'm not sick. I'm actually very healthy. Did your mom say I was sick?" He looked confused now, his small forehead wrinkling. "She says you forget things and that you're fragile. She says old people are fragile, and we have to be really nice to them because they might break." I pulled into my driveway and turned off the car, taking a moment to collect myself before looking at my grandson. His brown eyes, Robert's eyes, were watching me with concern now, sensing something wrong even if he couldn't articulate what. "Tyler, I want you to know something really important. I'm not sick, and I'm not fragile. I'm healthy and strong, and I plan to be around for a very long time. Your mom might be worried about me because that's what adults do sometimes. They worry too much. But there's nothing wrong with me, okay?" He nodded slowly, still looking uncertain. "You're really not sick?" I smiled and took his hand. "Really, truly. I promise. And you know what? I love you more than anything in the world, and nothing makes me happier than spending time with you. Not because of houses or rooms or stuff, but just because you're you and I'm your grandma." He seemed relieved by this, his expression clearing. "I love you too, Grandma. You make the best cookies." We went inside, and I made him hot chocolate with extra marshmallows, and we played board games for the rest of the afternoon until Daniel and Amanda arrived to collect him. When they rang the doorbell, I had to force myself to greet them normally, to smile and chat about our day, to pretend I hadn't just learned that they'd been systematically poisoning my grandson's perception of me. Amanda asked Tyler if he'd had fun, and he enthusiastically recounted the museum highlights. She caught my eye and smiled warmly. "Thanks so much for taking him, Mom. It means so much that you're so involved in the kids' lives." After they left, I sat in my living room as evening shadows lengthened and made a list of everything I now knew for certain. 1. They'd been having repeated, detailed conversations with Tyler about my death and their inheritance. 2. Amanda had told Tyler I was sick and forgetful when I was neither. 3. They'd been showing him pictures of rooms in my house, letting him choose which would be his, making my death seem imminent and desirable. 4. They'd instructed him to keep these conversations secret from me. 5. This had been going on long enough that Tyler had absorbed it as normal, as just another aspect of family life. The calculated nature of it was breathtaking, really. This wasn't accidental or impulsive. This was systematic manipulation of a child. I needed more information, different kinds of information. Over the next few days, I started paying attention to things I'd previously overlooked. I checked my credit report and discovered that someone had run a credit inquiry on me 3 months ago. A company I didn't recognize, didn't do business with, had never authorized. I called the company and learned it was a life insurance firm. Someone had apparently been shopping for life insurance policies on me, checking what my insurability looked like. The inquiry had come from an IP address that, when I paid a small fee for more detailed information, tracked to Daniel and Amanda's home address. I examined my bank statements more carefully and noticed a pattern I'd missed before. Every month, like clockwork, there was a small debit for $12.99 to something called Estate Planning Resources Pro. I'd never signed up for any such service. I called my bank and learned the charge had been authorized 5 months ago using my debit card number, but from a different IP address. Again, one that tracked to Daniel's house. I had them cancel the subscription and send me documentation of when and how it had been set up. Apparently, someone with access to my debit card had subscribed to some kind of estate planning software, presumably to research my assets or learn about inheritance law. I started reviewing my recent visitor's log. I kept a casual notebook by my door where I noted when people stopped by, just a habit left over from my more socially active years. Amanda had been here alone several times in the past 6 months, always with reasonable excuses. She needed to drop something off, pick something up, borrow something. Each visit had been brief, maybe 15 or 20 minutes. I'd never thought anything of it, but now I wondered what she'd been doing during those unsupervised minutes in my house. I began checking drawers, files, personal spaces I'd never had reason to secure before. In my home office, I kept files with all my important documents, deed to the house, insurance policies, investment statements, the copy of my will. The files looked undisturbed, but when I examined them closely, they weren't in the exact order I always maintained. I was meticulous about filing, about keeping things organized in specific ways, a habit from my library days. These had been moved, however carefully, then replaced slightly wrong. Someone had been through my personal papers, reading my will, examining my assets, taking inventory of what they'd eventually inherit. My jewelry box showed similar signs of intrusion. Nothing was missing. I checked my grandmother's pearls, my engagement ring, the antique brooch Robert had given me for our 25th anniversary. But pieces had been shifted, rearranged by someone who didn't know my system. I'd always organized it a specific way, with the pieces I wore most often on the right side and sentimental heirlooms on the left. Now they were mixed together, carelessly jumbled. Amanda had been here alone 2 weeks ago, claiming she needed to drop off a casserole dish she'd borrowed. She'd been upstairs briefly, supposedly using the bathroom. She'd been examining my jewelry, taking pictures perhaps, calculating values. I felt violated in ways I'd never experienced, not even when we'd had an actual break-in 10 years ago. That had been a random crime, impersonal, easily dismissed as bad luck. This was intimate betrayal. Family members cataloging my possessions like vultures circling prey that wasn't quite dead yet. Every item they'd touched, every drawer they'd opened, represented not just invasion of privacy, but active malice, a complete disregard for my autonomy and dignity. They'd been treating me like I was already deceased, my home already theirs to inventory and divide. I decided I needed professional help, someone who could advise me on legal protections and options. I called my attorney, Patricia Morrison, whom I'd known for 20 years. She'd handled my will after Robert died, helped me navigate the insurance claims, provided advice on various legal matters over the years. I trusted her completely and knew she'd be discreet. I made an appointment for the following Tuesday, telling her receptionist only that I needed to discuss updating my estate documents. I didn't want details in any system that Daniel or Amanda might somehow access. Tuesday morning arrived, and I drove to Patricia's office in the nice part of town. the kind of building with marble floors and expensive art, and lawyers who charged $300 an hour. Patricia greeted me warmly in her corner office with its view of downtown. She was about my age, 70-something, with silver hair cut in a sharp bob and the kind of direct gaze that missed nothing. "Helen," she said, gesturing to a leather chair. "Good to see you. What can I help you with today?" I sat down and took a deep breath. I need to change my will, establish some trusts, and possibly explore guardianship options for my grandchildren. And I need it done quickly and completely confidentially. Patricia's eyebrows rose slightly, but she simply opened her laptop and pulled up my file. "Tell me what's happened." So I did. I told her everything. The overheard conversation, the investigation, the credit inquiries, the evidence of them going through my things, Tyler's revelations about their discussions of my death. I watched Patricia's expression shift from professional interest to genuine shock to cold anger on my behalf. When I finished, she was silent for a long moment, clearly processing. "How do you want to handle this?" she finally asked. I'd been thinking about this for days, and my answer was ready. "I want to create an irrevocable trust that holds the house and most of my liquid assets. I want to designate trustees, maybe you, maybe someone else you recommend, who will manage it according to my instructions. I want to ensure that Daniel and Amanda never inherit a penny of my estate, but I also want to protect Tyler and Emma's futures. They're innocent in this, and I won't punish them for their parents' behavior. I want the trust structured so that when my grandchildren turn 25, they'll each inherit a substantial sum, but their parents will have no access to it, no control over it, no way to manipulate them into handing it over." Patricia was typing rapidly, nodding as I spoke. "That's absolutely doable. We can create a trust that specifically excludes Daniel and Amanda, designates independent trustees, and sets clear parameters for the grandchildren's inheritances. We can also include spendthrift provisions that prevent the money from being claimed by creditors or grasping parents." What about the house? I'd thought about this too, about my beautiful Victorian that I'd poured my life into. I want to leave it to Tyler and Emma jointly, but in the trust, with provisions that they can't sell or access it until they're both over 25. Until then, trustee-approved family members can live there. Maybe my cousin Margaret, she's always loved this house. Or it can be rented out with the income going into the trust for the kids' benefit. "And you want to completely disinherit Daniel?" Patricia asked, her tone carefully neutral, making sure I understood the gravity of what I was doing. I met her eyes steadily. "Completely. I want it explicitly stated that he's being excluded due to his actions, and that any attempt by him to challenge the will should result in further penalties. Can we do that?" She nodded. "Yes. We can include a no-contest clause that says if he challenges the will, he loses any minor bequests we might include as tokens. We could leave him something minimal, say $1,000, specifically so there's something to lose if he contests. It sometimes discourages challenges." We spent 3 hours that day working through the details. Patricia explained trusts, guardianships, tax implications, legal protections. She warned me that Daniel and Amanda could still try to challenge these arrangements, could claim undue influence or diminished capacity on my part, could make my death a legal nightmare for my trustees and grandchildren. I told her I wanted every possible protection built in. Letters testifying to my sound mind, video testimony explaining my decisions, psychiatric evaluation if necessary to prove my competency. I wanted my intentions so clear, so thoroughly documented, that no judge would ever side with Daniel's claims. Patricia suggested we also include instructions about my grandchildren's upbringing. If something happened to Daniel and Amanda, who would raise Tyler and Emma? I hadn't thought about this, hadn't considered that I might outlive my son despite his apparent eagerness for the reverse. We discussed options. My younger cousin Margaret and her husband were good people, stable, with grown children of their own. They'd be willing, I thought, to take in 2 kids if necessary. Patricia made notes, explaining that we'd need to contact them, get their agreement, ensure legal documentation of their willingness to serve as guardians. "Helen," Patricia said as we were wrapping up, "I have to ask. Do you want to confront Daniel and Amanda about what you've discovered? Before we finalize these changes, I thought about it, about the satisfaction of telling them exactly what I knew, about watching their faces as their plans collapsed. But I shook my head. Not yet. Let's get everything legal and ironclad first. Then I'll decide how and when to let them know. I want them to have no warning, no opportunity to manipulate me or the situation. They've been so careful and calculating. I need to be more careful, more calculating. Patricia smiled, a cold expression that held no humor. You know, in 40 years of practicing law, I've seen a lot of family ugliness. But this is particularly brazen. Your son and daughter-in-law have no idea what they're dealing with. You're stronger than they think. We scheduled follow-up appointments for the rest of that week. Patricia would draft the trust documents, the new will, the guardianship papers. She'd arrange for a psychiatrist to evaluate my mental competency, not because there was any doubt, but to create documentation that would defeat any future challenges. She'd prepare video testimony where I'd explain my decisions in my own words. She'd build a legal fortress around my assets that Daniel and Amanda couldn't breach. And she'd do it all quickly, because at 67, none of us knew how much time I actually had, and I wanted these protections in place immediately. Over the next 2 weeks, I made multiple trips to Patricia's office. I signed document after document, each signature feeling like a small act of justice. I sat for a psychiatric evaluation where a kindly doctor in his 50s asked me extensive questions about my mental state, my memory, my understanding of financial and legal matters. He concluded I was exceptionally cogent and mentally acute, and provided a detailed letter to that effect. I recorded video testimony, sitting in Patricia's conference room, looking directly at the camera and explaining calmly why I was making these decisions. I detailed what I'd overheard, what I'd discovered, how deeply betrayed I felt. I cried while recording. I couldn't help it. But my voice remained steady as I stated that these were my genuine wishes, made with full understanding of the consequences. Patricia had one more suggestion. We should update your medical directives too, your power of attorney for healthcare decisions. Right now, Daniel is listed as your healthcare proxy. Given what you've discovered, do you really want him making medical decisions if you're incapacitated? The thought made my blood run cold. Daniel in control of my medical care, making choices about life support or treatment, potentially motivated by his eagerness to inherit? I immediately designated Patricia herself as my healthcare proxy, with my cousin Margaret as backup. I created detailed living will instructions about my wishes for end-of-life care. I made sure no decision about my health or death would ever be in Daniel's hands. Throughout this process, I maintained completely normal contact with Daniel and Amanda. They called twice that week, and I answered cheerfully, chatting about nothing in particular. Amanda invited me to Emma's dance recital the following month, and I accepted with appropriate grandmother enthusiasm. Daniel asked if I needed help with anything around the house, and I assured him everything was fine. I was careful not to change my routine, not to give them any sign that I was aware of their schemes. I played the role of the oblivious elderly mother perfectly, all while building legal walls they'd never breach. 3 weeks after that devastating conversation I'd overheard, Patricia called me into her office for the final signing. Everything was ready, the trust documents, the new will, all the supporting materials. She'd arranged for 2 witnesses and a notary, people from her office who had no connection to my family. We gathered in her conference room, and I signed my name over and over, initializing pages, dating documents, creating the new legal reality that would govern my estate. When it was done, Patricia handed me copies of everything, thick folders full of legal protections. "It's done," she said simply. "You're protected. Your grandchildren are protected, and your son will inherit exactly what he deserves. Nothing." I held those folders like they were precious, because they were. They represented justice, protection, the power to control my own legacy. But I still hadn't decided when or how to tell Daniel and Amanda what I'd done. Part of me wanted to confront them immediately, to see their faces when they realized their careful plans had been for nothing. But another part wanted to wait, to keep this trump card hidden until it would have maximum impact. Patricia advised waiting at least until all the administrative details were complete. The trust needed to be officially recorded. Assets needed to be transferred. Everything needed to be absolutely final and unchangeable. It was during this waiting period that Amanda made a critical mistake. She called me one afternoon, her voice warm and concerned, saying she'd been thinking about me and wanted to stop by for coffee. Could she come over tomorrow? I agreed, and she arrived the next day with pastries from an expensive bakery and a smile that no longer fooled me. We sat in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd baked cookies with Tyler, where Robert and I had danced, where I'd raised my son. She chatted about the kids, about Daniel's work, about her busy schedule. And then, casually, she said, "Mom, Daniel and I have been talking, and we think it might be time for you to consider moving into a retirement community." I set down my coffee cup carefully. "A retirement community?" She nodded, her expression sympathetic. "We know this house is a lot to maintain. All these stairs, the yard work, being alone here at night. There are some beautiful communities nearby with activities and social opportunities and professional medical staff. We've actually been looking into them, and we found a few that offer really comprehensive care. We could help you downsize, get the house ready to sell, make the transition easy." Every word confirmed what I'd suspected. They weren't content to wait for my death. They wanted me out of the house now, warehoused in some facility while they sold my home and spent my money. "I'm not interested in a retirement community," I said evenly. "I'm healthy, active, and perfectly capable of maintaining my own home. I have no intention of moving." Amanda's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "We're just worried about you, Mom. You're not getting any younger, and this house is really too much for one person. What if you fell on the stairs? What if something happened and no one was here to help? We love you too much to let you take those risks." The manipulation was so transparent now that I wondered how I'd ever missed it. Every word framed as concern, but actually pushing me toward giving up my independence, my home, my assets. "Amanda," I said calmly, "I appreciate your concern, but my decision is final. I'm staying in my home." She looked frustrated now, the mask slipping slightly. "Daniel is really worried. We think, it's irresponsible for you to be so stubborn about this. We're your family. We're trying to help you make good decisions." The condescension was breathtaking. The assumption that I was too senile or stupid to manage my own life. "I'm making perfectly good decisions," I replied. "I'm financially secure, physically healthy, and mentally sharp. There's no reason for me to move except your apparent desire to get me out of this house." Amanda's expression shifted, something cold flickering in her blue eyes. "That's not fair, Mom. We're not trying to get you out. We're trying to help you be safe and comfortable. If you're going to interpret our love and concern as some kind of selfish plot, then maybe we need to reevaluate how much we involve ourselves in your life." It was a threat, thinly veiled. "Agree to our plans or we'll cut you off from your grandchildren." I felt anger surge through me but kept my voice level. "Amanda, I think you should leave now. Thank you for the pastries." She stood, looking shocked that I'd dismissed her. "Mom, I don't think you understand how serious we are about this. Your safety is our priority." I stood too, meeting her eyes directly. "My safety is my priority, and I'm perfectly safe here in my own home, making my own decisions about my life. Now please leave." She gathered her purse and coat, her movements sharp with anger. At the door, she turned back. "Daniel is going to be very disappointed. He was hoping you'd be more reasonable about this." I closed the door without responding and locked it behind her. I stood in my hallway, hands shaking with rage and adrenaline, realizing that the situation was accelerating. They weren't just waiting for my death anymore. They were actively trying to push me out of my home, into a facility where they'd have more control, where they could possibly gain legal power over my finances and health care. The urgency I'd felt before doubled. I called Patricia immediately and told her about the conversation. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "Helen, I think it's time to tell them. Not everything, maybe, but enough to make clear that you're aware of their intentions and that you've taken steps to protect yourself. Otherwise, They might escalate further. We planned carefully what I'd say and when. Patricia suggested I do it in her office. With her present as witness and support, we'd invite Daniel and Amanda under the pretense of discussing estate planning, let them think I was actually agreeing to their suggestions. Then we'd drop the truth on them in an environment where their reactions would be witnessed and documented. I agreed. Patricia sent a formal letter to Daniel and Amanda, written on her law firm letterhead, inviting them to a meeting to discuss my estate planning. The letter was vague enough to be intriguing, but gave no hint of what was actually coming. The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday at 2 o'clock. Daniel called me that evening, his voice carefully casual. "Hey, Mom, we got a letter from your lawyer about a meeting? What's that about?" I kept my tone equally casual. "Oh, just some updates to my will and estate documents. I thought it would be good to discuss them with you since you're my heir." Patricia suggested having a formal meeting to go over everything. There was a pause, and I could almost hear the mental calculations. "Okay, that sounds good. We'll be there." They thought they'd won, I realized. They thought I was preparing to hand over control, to sign documents making them powers of attorney, to facilitate their takeover of my life and assets. Thursday afternoon arrived sunny and crisp. I dressed carefully that morning, choosing a blue suit I'd bought for Robert's funeral, professional and dignified. I wanted to look competent, sharp, someone in full command of her faculties. I drove to Patricia's office and arrived 15 minutes early. She met me in the conference room, already prepared with folders full of documents. "How are you holding up?" she asked. I took a deep breath. "I'm ready. Let's do this." She squeezed my hand briefly, a gesture of solidarity that meant more than she probably knew. Daniel and Amanda arrived exactly on time, both dressed professionally. Daniel in a suit, Amanda in an expensive dress and heels. They greeted me with hugs and kisses that felt like sandpaper against my skin now. Patricia welcomed them courteously and invited everyone to sit around the large conference table. She'd arranged it, so I sat at the head of the table with her beside me, Daniel and Amanda across from us like they were the ones being interviewed. The power dynamic was subtle but deliberate. "Thank you both for coming," Patricia began formally. "Helen has asked me to conduct this meeting to discuss some recent changes to her estate planning documents. Helen, would you like to start?" I looked at my son. At this man I'd given birth to, raised, sacrificed for, loved with every fiber of my being. He looked relaxed, expectant, completely unprepared for what was coming. "Daniel, Amanda," I began, my voice steady. "Several weeks ago, I overheard a conversation between Amanda and Tyler. Amanda was explaining to my 8-year-old grandson that I was old and would die soon, that this house would become theirs, that he should pick out which room he wanted. She instructed him not to tell me about these conversations." Amanda's face went pale, then flushed red. Daniel looked confused, glancing between us. "Mom, I don't know what you think you heard, but..." I held up my hand. "I know exactly what I heard, and subsequent investigation revealed much more. I discovered that someone used my debit card to subscribe to estate planning software. Someone ran a credit inquiry on me through a life insurance company. Someone has been going through my personal papers and my jewelry box during supposedly innocent visits. Someone has been systematically teaching my grandchildren to view me as an obstacle and my death as a financial opportunity." The room was silent except for the hum of the air conditioning. Amanda had tears forming in her eyes. Crocodile tears, I was certain. Daniel's face had cycled through shock to anger to something like fear. "This is insane," he said, his voice rising. "You're being paranoid. We've been nothing but loving and supportive to you, and you're accusing us of... what exactly? Wanting you to die? That's sick, Mom. That's really sick." His indignation would have been convincing if I hadn't known the truth. Patricia spoke up, her voice cold and professional. "Daniel, we have substantial documentation of these activities, IP addresses, credit inquiries, witness statements. But that's not why we're here. We're here to inform you that Helen has made significant changes to her estate plans in response to your behavior." She slid folders across the table to them. "These are copies of Helen's new will and trust documents. I encourage you to review them carefully with your own attorney. Daniel grabbed the folder and started flipping through pages, his expression growing increasingly thunderous. Amanda was reading over his shoulder, her face draining of color as the implications became clear. "You disinherited me?" Daniel finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're leaving everything to Tyler and Emma in a trust we can't access?" I nodded. "That's correct. I'm leaving my grandchildren a substantial inheritance that will be available to them when they turn 25, managed by independent trustees until then. You and Amanda are explicitly excluded from my will. You'll inherit nothing from me." "You can't do this," Amanda said, her tears forgotten, her voice sharp with anger. "This is elder abuse. She's clearly been manipulated, Patricia. You've taken advantage of a vulnerable old woman." Patricia's smile was dangerous. "Amanda, Helen underwent a complete psychiatric evaluation confirming her mental competency. She's recorded video testimony explaining her decisions in detail. She's more than capable of making these choices, and they're legally ironclad. But please, feel free to challenge them in court and spend years and thousands of dollars trying to break a will that's been specifically designed to withstand such challenges." Daniel stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is unbelievable. After everything we've done for you, all the time we've spent, all the care we've shown, this is how you repay us? By believing paranoid fantasies and punishing us?" His righteous anger might have moved me once. Now, it just made me tired. "Daniel," I said quietly, "I heard Amanda with my own ears telling Tyler about my death like it was Christmas morning. I have proof of your unauthorized access to my financial information. I know you've been going through my things, planning for my death, teaching my grandchildren terrible lessons about family and love and greed. These aren't fantasies. This is what you've done." "We were trying to help you," Amanda shouted, losing her composure entirely. "You need help. You're old and alone and making terrible decisions, and we were trying to be there for you, to plan for your future, to make sure you'd be taken care of. And this is how you thank us?" The mask had completely fallen away now, revealing the grasping, entitled woman beneath. "You were helping yourselves to my assets before I was even dead," I replied. "You were counting my money, dividing my possessions, and teaching my grandchildren to celebrate my death. That's not help, Amanda. That's grave robbery before the grave." Daniel leaned forward, his hands flat on the table, his face twisted with anger. "Fine. You want to cut us out? Cut us out. But don't expect to see your grandchildren anymore. If we're not good enough to inherit from you, you're not good enough to have a relationship with Tyler and Emma. See how that works out for you, alone in that big house you're so desperate to keep from us." It was the threat I'd been expecting, the weapon they'd been holding in reserve. Patricia intervened before I could respond. "Daniel, that's parental alienation, and it's illegal in this state. If you prevent Helen from having contact with her grandchildren out of spite over inheritance issues, she can petition the court for grandparent visitation rights. I'd strongly advise against making threats you can't legally follow through on." Daniel grabbed Amanda's arm. "We're leaving. Come on." They headed for the door, Amanda pausing to throw one last venomous look over her shoulder. "You'll regret this. You'll die alone and miserable, and we'll make sure Tyler and Emma forget you ever existed." The door slammed behind them with enough force to rattle the framed degrees on Patricia's wall. I sat very still, processing what had just happened, the finality of this rupture. Patricia reached over and squeezed my hand. "You did the right thing. That was incredibly brave, but I didn't feel brave. I felt devastated, hollowed out, ancient in ways that had nothing to do with my 67 years. That was my son who'd just stormed out, my only child, the baby I'd rocked and raised and loved unconditionally. The man who'd just threatened to take away my grandchildren, to erase me from their lives, to punish me for protecting my own assets and autonomy. How had we arrived at this place? When had he become someone who valued money over his mother? Or had he always been this person, and I'd been too loving, too blind, too devoted to see it? Patricia let me sit quietly for a few minutes. then gently suggested, "Helen, we should document this conversation while it's fresh. Their threats, their reactions, everything. It may be relevant later." So I spent another hour in her office, writing down everything that had been said, every threat Daniel had made, every accusation Amanda had thrown. Patricia would add it to the file, more documentation of their character, more evidence supporting my decisions. When I finally left her office, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that Robert would have loved. I drove home feeling simultaneously lighter and heavier than I'd ever felt. The next few weeks were strange and painful. Daniel and Amanda made good on their threats initially. No phone calls, no visits, no communication. I didn't see Tyler or Emma. I'd known this might happen, but knowing it and living it were different things. I missed my grandchildren with a physical ache, worried about what lies their parents were telling them about me. What poison was being dripped into their innocent ears. Patricia filed a preliminary petition for grandparent visitation rights, warning me it could take months to resolve but that the law was on my side. Then something unexpected happened. About 3 weeks after our confrontation, my doorbell rang on a Saturday morning. I opened it to find my younger cousin Margaret standing there with a basket of muffins and a determined expression. "I heard," she said simply. "Daniel called me, trying to turn the family against you, trying to make you sound crazy and vindictive. He miscalculated. I knew you too well to believe his version." She came inside, and we spent hours talking. I told her everything, showed her the documentation, explained my decisions. Margaret listened without interruption, then hugged me fiercely. "You did exactly right. Robert would be proud of you. And I'll make sure the whole family knows the truth." And she did. Margaret has a big mouth. She'd joke about it herself. And within days, the extended family knew what had actually happened. My sister-in-law, Robert's sister June, called crying with rage at Daniel's behavior. My nephew called offering support. Other cousins reached out, some sharing their own stories of Daniel and Amanda's entitlement, behavior they'd noticed and dismissed as minor, but now understood as part of a pattern. The family closed ranks around me, not around Daniel. He'd been counting on family loyalty, on people taking his side automatically. He'd miscalculated badly. The court system moved slowly, but Patricia was relentless. She filed for emergency grandparent visitation, arguing that the sudden termination of my relationship with Tyler and Emma was harmful to the children and motivated purely by spite over inheritance issues. She submitted all our documentation, the overheard conversations, Tyler's revelations, the evidence of financial snooping, the video of the confrontation in her office. Daniel and Amanda fought back, hiring an expensive attorney of their own, claiming I was mentally unstable, that my influence on the children was harmful, that they had every right as parents to determine who had access to their kids. But here's what they didn't anticipate. Tyler loved me genuinely, and 8-year-olds are terrible at hiding their feelings. When the court appointed a guardian ad litem to interview the children and assess their best interests, Tyler apparently cried and said he missed his grandma, that he didn't understand why he couldn't see me anymore, that his parents said I was mad at them but he didn't know why. He mentioned innocently that his mom had been telling him about getting grandma's house someday. Exactly the kind of detail that made the guardian's eyebrows rise. The guardian's report was damning for Daniel and Amanda, recommending that I be granted supervised visitation immediately and unsupervised visitation pending further review. The judge, a woman in her 60s who reminded me a bit of Patricia, listened to both sides present their cases. Daniel's lawyer painted me as a vindictive old woman punishing her son over money, creating division in the family, potentially suffering from paranoid delusions. Patricia calmly presented our evidence, the psychiatric evaluation, the video testimony, the documentation of Daniel and Amanda's behavior. She let the facts speak for themselves. The judge took 2 days to rule, and when she did, her decision was clear. I was granted immediate visitation rights, 4 hours every Saturday, supervised initially by a neutral third party, with review for expanded access in 3 months. The first Saturday after the ruling, I met Tyler and Emma at a park, accompanied by a social worker named Mrs. Chen who was kind but professional. Tyler ran to me immediately, hugging me fiercely, chattering about everything I'd missed in the past month. Emma was more reserved. She was younger and more easily influenced by her parents, but she warmed up quickly when I pulled out a new coloring book I'd brought her. We spent 4 hours together that felt both endless and too short, playing and talking and just being together. I was careful not to say anything negative about Daniel and Amanda, not to put the children in the middle of adult conflicts. I just loved them, listened to them, tried to give them some stability in what I knew was a confusing situation. Mrs. Chen observed but didn't intrude, taking notes occasionally. At the end of the 4 hours, when Daniel arrived to pick up the kids, the temperature dropped noticeably. He refused to look at me, spoke only to Mrs. Chen, hustled Tyler and Emma to the car without allowing them to properly say goodbye. Tyler looked back at me through the car window, waving, and I waved back with a smile that hurt my face. The social worker watched them drive away, then turned to me. "Mrs. Anderson, I'll be recommending unsupervised visitation in my report. Your relationship with your grandchildren is clearly positive and loving. There's no reason to maintain restrictions." 3 months after our initial confrontation, the family dynamics had settled into a new abnormal. I saw Tyler and Emma every Saturday, then eventually every other weekend for full days. Daniel and Amanda maintained icy silence with me, dropping off and picking up the children without a word, without eye contact, radiating hostility. The children were clearly caught in the middle, aware of the tension even if they didn't fully understand it. I did my best to give them a refuge from it, to let my house be a place where they could just be kids without all the adult ugliness. My relationship with the broader family strengthened. Margaret and I grew closer than we'd been in decades, talking several times a week, planning activities together. Robert's sister June became a regular visitor, often coming over for dinner and long conversations about her brother and our families and everything that had happened. My nephew started stopping by to help with yard work, refusing payment, just wanting to show support. I realized I'd been so focused on Daniel and his family for years that I'd neglected other relationships, other connections. This forced separation had, paradoxically, enriched my life in unexpected ways. Daniel and Amanda made one more attempt to access my money. About 4 months after our confrontation, they showed up at my door, the first time they'd voluntarily approached me since that day in Patricia's office. They looked terrible, actually. Amanda's usual polish dimmed, Daniel's face drawn with stress. They asked if we could talk, and I invited them in warily. They sat in my living room and Amanda started crying. "Mom, we're in serious financial trouble. Daniel lost his job and we're about to lose our house. We need help. A loan, just enough to catch up on mortgage payments, maybe $30,000. We'll pay you back, I swear." I looked at them sitting there. This couple who'd been planning for my death, who'd coached my grandson about inheriting my home, who'd tried to manipulate me into a nursing home, who'd cut me off from my grandchildren. They were asking me to solve their financial crisis, to open my wallet once again. Part of me, the maternal part that never fully dies, wanted to help. Daniel was still my son, and his children's security mattered to me. But the stronger part of me, the part forged in betrayal and anger, said absolutely not. "I'm not giving you money," I said firmly. "You've made it clear you view me only as a source of inheritance. I'm not going to fund your lifestyle or bail you out of problems you've created." Daniel's expression hardened. "So you'll just let your grandchildren become homeless? That's the kind of grandmother you are?" It was manipulative, cruel, designed to provoke guilt. It might have worked before. Now I just felt tired. If you're truly facing homelessness, there are social services, family members who might help. Jobs Daniel can take even if they're below his preferred status level. I'm not your bailout plan. You burned that bridge when you taught Tyler to celebrate my death. They left without another word, and I haven't seen them voluntarily since. I learned later through Margaret that they did lose their house, that they'd been living beyond their means for years, financing a lifestyle they couldn't afford with credit and expectations of eventual inheritance. They moved into a smaller rental, had to give up the BMW I'd helped them buy, downscaled dramatically. Part of me felt guilty. wondered if I should have helped for the children's sake. But Patricia reminded me that enabling their irresponsibility wouldn't help anyone, especially not Tyler and Emma in the long run. Sometimes the kindest thing is letting people face the natural consequences of their choices. The children's welfare remained my primary concern. Through the court-ordered visitation, I was able to maintain a relationship with them, to provide some stability and love in their increasingly chaotic home life. Tyler started asking questions as he got older, wanting to understand why things had changed, why Daddy and Mommy didn't talk to Grandma anymore. I never lied to him, but I tried to frame things age-appropriately. Sometimes adults disagree about important things, and those disagreements mean they need space from each other. But I will always love you and your sister, always want to be part of your lives. That never changes. I updated my trust documents to include provisions for Tyler and Emma's education, housing if needed, and support if their parents couldn't provide adequately. Patricia structured it so that if they truly faced hardship, the trustee could approve expenditures for their benefit, paying for school clothes, covering medical expenses, ensuring they had what they needed. But the money would go directly to providers, never through Daniel and Amanda's hands. It wasn't perfect, but it was the best way I could protect my grandchildren while maintaining boundaries with their parents. Now, 2 years after that devastating overheard conversation, I'm 69 years old and healthier than ever, frankly. The stress of the confrontation and legal battles has passed, leaving me with a strange sense of peace. I still live in my beautiful Victorian, still garden, and maintain the home Robert and I built together. Tyler is 10 now, Emma is 7, and I see them regularly. They're good kids, resilient despite their parents' choices, and I'm grateful I get to be part of their lives. Daniel and Amanda have essentially disappeared from mine except for the necessary exchanges during child handoffs. I don't miss them, which probably says everything about what that relationship had become. My trust is ironclad, my will is clear, and my grandchildren's futures are as secure as I can make them. When I eventually do die, Daniel and Amanda will get nothing from my estate except the knowledge that their greed cost them everything. Tyler and Emma will inherit substantially when they turn 25, enough to buy homes, start businesses, pursue educations without debt, build lives on a foundation of security I worked decades to create. They'll know their grandma loved them, fought for them, protected them even when it meant standing against their own father. That legacy matters more to me than any amount of money. The story you've just heard has been modified in names and places to protect the identities of the people involved. I'm not sharing this to judge, but with the hope that someone listening might pause and reflect on how many mothers are suffering in silence within their own families, watching their children measure their worth in dollars rather than love, counting down the days until inheritance rather than cherishing the time that remains. I genuinely wonder, if you were in my place, what would you have done? Would you have chosen silence to keep the peace, hoping things would somehow improve? Or would you have dared to confront it all, to risk everything to reclaim your voice and dignity? I want to know your thoughts because every story can become a candle that lights the way for others facing similar darkness. God always blesses us, and I truly believe that courage leads us to better days, even when those days look different than we imagined. Standing up for yourself isn't cruel. It's necessary. Protecting what you've built isn't selfish, it's wise. And teaching the next generation that love cannot be measured in square footage or bank account balances isn't vindictive. It's perhaps the most important lesson of all. Meanwhile, on the final screen, I'm leaving you with 2 of the channel's favorite stories. I'm certain you'll be surprised by what other families have faced, what other grandmothers and mothers have endured, and how they found their own paths through betrayal to something like justice. Thank you for listening, for your support, and for being part of this community where we can share